Tonight, Comrade Hardy is going to be talking about money and inflation, and we're going to take it in two parts with question period in between. He's first of all going to be looking at Marx and the Marxist view of money, of inflation, and then at the monetarists. So perhaps if we have a question period on Marx's view first, and then go on to discuss monetarism after that. Comrade Hardy.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as you know, the subject is money and inflation, and the purpose primarily is to explain Marx's theory of inflation. If this was taking place in the year 1880 instead of 1980, it would be considerably simpler to put it over, because in the 19th century there were a number of economists who more or less took the same view of Marx as to what caused inflation. And students of most economic textbooks in 1880 would have understood what Marx was talking about, even if they didn't entirely agree with it. Well, it's now become very much more difficult. It's become confused. The first reason being the popularization of the theories of the economist John Maynard Keynes, because Keynes brought along with him some fallacious ideas about money and banking. Now, as you know, Keynes is in some disrepute, and a lot of the Keynesians have now become monetarists, like Rees-Mogg, the editor of the Times. But this has only increased the confusion, because the monetarists use language which appears to be the same as the language used by Marx, and that is something entirely misleading. They, for example, say that inflation is a monetary phenomenon due to the money supply being too great. Well, to a superficial view, this looks like Marx's theory. Marx's theory was that the currency is issued in excess, that is, notes and coin, but primarily notes. But in fact, there is no affinity whatever between Marx's view and the view of the monetarists. Marx, as I say, was talking about currency, pound notes, £5 notes, £10 notes, and saying that if you have them issued in excess, you will have inflation, that is, prices will go up. But when Dennis Healey, who was adopting monetarist views 2 years ago, and Mrs. Thatcher say, as they both did, and I quote, "We are not printing money now," they didn't mean they weren't printing notes, because in fact both of them, and it's still continuing, were churning out notes through the Bank of England by the hundreds of millions. What they meant was that they were not borrowing excessively from the banks. I'll deal with this later on, of course. And they both, the monetarists in general, with one partial exception, deny that notes have anything whatever to do with inflation. There is another additional cause of confusion, because the monetarists aren't just one school. To some extent they differ between themselves. Rees-Mogg, the editor of the Times, who has done more than anybody else to popularise monetarist views in this country in recent years through the Times, has recently discovered Ricardo's labour theory of value, which means, in fact, that Rees-Mogg, so to speak, has broken ranks with some of the other monetarists and has moved a little way towards Marx, because, as you know, Marx's labour theory of value was derived from Ricardo's. It was an improvement on Ricardo's. And Marx based his explanation of inflation on the labour theory of value. And you've got another odd deviation. Milton Friedman, the leading American monetarist, is now riding two horses. He's now saying that inflation is due to two things. First, to the government printing too many notes, just like Marx. But then he ties it up with the statement that it's also due to the banks, the government borrowing too much from the banks. So, as I say, you've got Milton Friedman now riding two horses and confusing the thing more than ever. But the point I want to make here is that the Keynesians and the monetarists both had monetary and banking theories which are completely untenable. The late Professor Cannon, who was not a Marxist but who thoroughly understood inflation, described these theorists as the mystical school of banking theorists, a description that is fully justified and that I'll deal with later. So now I have to say that in order to explain Marx's theory of inflation, I've also got to take in the monetarists and deal with their theory of inflation to show that it has no affinity whatever with Marx's view. Now, as I have said, Marx has based his theory of inflation on his labour theory of value. And as you know, that labour theory of value is that in the production of commodities, a certain amount of labour is required, and that amount of labour measures the relative value of the commodities. If, for example, it requires 1 hour of labour to produce a pound weight of bread, 10 hours to produce a pound weight of silver, and 80 hours to produce a pound weight of gold, then their values will be in the ratio of 1 to 10 to 80. Or to put it the other way round, the value of gold would be 80 times the value of bread. Incidentally, those figures 1, 10, 80 aren't real ones, but they just give you a broad picture of the sort of relativity. When, therefore, we see that a pound weight of silver sells at a much higher price than a pound weight of bread, and gold sells at a much higher price than a pound weight of silver, what we are really looking at is what is behind the prices, and what is behind the prices is the relative value of these commodities, that is to say, the relative amounts of labour required to produce given quantities of them. Now, in the course of the development of capitalism, the practice grew up of using gold as the money commodity. They tried other things like silver and various other things, but by general consent in the 19th century they were all moving towards using gold as the money commodity. Now, in Marx's terminology, gold became the universal equivalent, by which he meant that because all commodities embody value related to the number of hours of labour to produce them, it is possible to use one commodity, and it was gold, as the universal equivalent for all the others. Instead of people having to measure their bread against silver and coal and oil and things like this, they measured all commodities against gold. Gold became the universal equivalent. Therefore it became the money commodity. Now, I heard recently a BBC alleged financial expert telling his listeners that gold has no intrinsic value. Now, this is, of course, nonsense. It is only because gold has value, like other commodities, that it can operate as the universal equivalent, that is, as the money commodity. Now, it would be theoretically possible to have capitalism operating with a currency consisting solely of gold coins of different sizes and values, with no copper or silver coins, no paper money, but simply gold coins. Now, if such a state existed, it would be necessary to have in circulation as the money commodity a certain total amount of gold, say 100 million ounces, which is something like the amount that was needed in the early part of this century. Suppose you had capitalism running entirely with gold coins, and that it totaled about 100 million ounces. What that would mean is that there was a total mass of gold circulating as the money commodity. As population grows and production increases, the needed amount of currency, that is the needed amount of gold, would increase. And there are various other factors that might operate either to increase it or to decrease it. In the 19th century, in this country actually, the currency consisted of copper and silver coins, gold coins and Bank of England notes. But by law, the copper and silver coins were exchangeable for a fixed amount of gold coins, and the gold coins were exchangeable at a fixed rate with Bank of England notes, and vice versa. You could go with your gold to the Bank of England and demand Bank of England notes at the ratio fixed by the government that £1 or sovereign is about 1/4 ounce weight of gold. Or you could go to the Bank of England with your paper money, your Bank of England notes, and demand gold coins for them at the same fixed rate, £1 equal to about 1/4 ounce weight of gold. That was the gold standard. And notice this, since the government by law said that the pound, the unit of currency, is about 1/4 ounce weight of gold, it meant that the price of gold was £4 approximately. because each quarter of an ounce of gold was fixed as the amount of gold in the pound, or as it was called, the sovereign. That was the gold standard as it worked in the 19th century. The Bank of England could only increase its note issue then, above a certain amount, by buying an equivalent amount of gold and stowing it away in the Bank of England vaults. If it put out an additional 10 million of notes, it had to buy 10 million pounds of gold and stick it in Bank of England vaults. So there never could be the situation that exists today, where there is no restriction whatever, no formal restriction on the note issue. And while the last Labour government was in office, the Bank of England pushed out an additional about 4,500 million pounds of notes, just printed them and pushed them into circulation on behalf, of course, of the government. Because of the gold standard, for about 100 years before 1914, there was no inflation. The price level in 1914 was actually slightly lower than it was in 1820, and at no point between 1820 and 1914 did the price level rise above the 1820 level. Now contrast that with what of course has happened in the last 30 years, where prices have been going up continuously, and the present price level in this country is about 13 times what it was in 1938. There is now, of course, no convertibility of the notes into gold, but there is a relic of the old convertibility. If you look at any of your pound notes, £5 notes, £10 notes, you will read on them, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £1. But of course it's still there, but it doesn't mean a thing. I mean, you think to yourself what it would mean. Suppose you could go to the Bank of England with a pound note and say, "I want a sovereign for this." Your sovereign would be worth about 70 quid. Needless to say, they are not going to give it to you, because although the words are still there, the convertibility has entirely disappeared. I just want to break off here to explain something that I know when I first looked at it I found a lot of difficulty with, and I've no doubt other people do. If you are told that at a given time and in given circumstances a certain total amount of currency needs to circulate, and you try to envisage it, you think there are millions of people today buying things, giving money for them and taking money in shops and betting shops and at banks and all over the place, all this money moving, millions of transactions passing to and from, all of different amounts, and then you try to say to yourself, how do I translate this into the amount of currency that is needed? Well, Professor Cannon, who, as I say, was not a Marxist but understood this business, gave a solution to the problem where he laid down the law: the demand for currency is a demand to hold currency. What Cannon said is, forget all this ungraspable millions of movements going on in the marketplace, and remember that the demand for currency is a demand to hold currency. Now, all of you, as individuals, will be carrying a certain amount of notes and coin with you, and you may possibly have some at home. And if you think, you will know that you're carrying more notes and coin now than you were, say, 10 years ago. And the same is true of every retailer, every betting shop, every railway booking office, particularly, of course, every bank. Now, if there's one thing banks do not want to do, it's to have notes and coin in their tills, because that's a dead loss to them. They want money to be earning them something. So the banks, every day and continuously, are always thinking to themselves, how can we keep to an absolute minimum the amount of notes and coin that we hold? Well, now you've got something you can get hold of. Now think of all the people, individuals and institutions, who are trying to hold as little currency, notes and coin, as they can, but nevertheless find that they must hold a certain amount. Now you can add up the total amounts that people want to hold, and now it gives a sort of meaning to this conception of how much currency is needed at any given time. Now coming back to Marx's definition of inflation. Marx defined inflation in this sort of way: it's a general price level caused by a depreciation of the currency. Now, depreciation of the currency takes place when it is issued in excess. Suppose, for example, in the 19th century, when there was no inflation, you remember, for practically 100 years, suppose the British government had repealed the law which said that every pound could be converted into a quarter of an ounce weight of gold. Suppose they'd repealed this and said in future there is no convertibility, and they did, at the moment they did it, of course, there was a certain total amount of currency in circulation. Now, the mere fact that that currency, which used to be convertible, the government changes the law and it becomes inconvertible, that does not itself create inflation, because the total amount of currency is unchanged. What causes inflation is an excess, or as Marx put it, if you have had a convertible currency or a totally gold currency circulating of a certain total amount, and the government takes away the convertibility, and then the government doubles the amount of currency in circulation, doubles the amount of paper, inconvertible paper in circulation, then that is inflation. The price level will double. If you double the currency, other things remaining the same, you will double the price level. That is what Marx meant by inflation. In 1938, the total amount of currency in circulation in this country was under 500 million pounds. It is now approaching 10,000 million. Now, of course, you can see why the price level has gone up. In Marx's terms, there has been a continual excess issue of an inconvertible paper currency. It is quite true that production is greater now than it was in 1938, so that the amount of currency people needed to hold would have been more anyway, but of course nothing like the jump from under 500 million to nearly 10,000 million. Now, that's Marx's view of inflation. How do you know, or how can you assume that Marx is correct in giving that view of inflation? Well, the first thing to notice is this, and it's a challenge, so to speak, that's been put for years and years and years. Nobody ever answers it. It is a fact that in the history of capitalism, in this country, on the continent, in America, Russia, everywhere else, whenever there has been an excess issue of currency, in Marx's terms, prices have gone up. And whenever the currency has been curtailed, the excess has been curtailed, prices have stabilised or have gone down. That is a fact. And anybody who disbelieves it, of course, can come along and try to show you some occasion when it didn't work. Well, nobody has ever come forward and said that they know a time and a place when there was an excess issue of currency and prices did not go up, or the converse of that. Now, that itself is not a proof. And someone who didn't believe it might come along and say, yeah, well, this is just coincidental. Prices and excess issue of currency all go together, but it doesn't prove that the one causes the other. They may say it doesn't prove that one causes the other because there is some third cause that operates on all these occasions. Very good, I mean, it's fair enough. But then, of course, they've got to tell you what this other cause is. And, of course, they will give you dozens of answers. The first answer they give you is that inflation is caused by wage increases. So let's have a look at it. Between 1850 and 1914, real wages went up by 90%. So those people who believe that inflation is caused by rising wages will be able to say, well, of course, prices ought to have gone up by at least 90% between 1850 and 1914, but they didn't go up at all. So that's the first objection disposed of. The second popular objection is that prices go up because of the greed of manufacturers, retailers, bankers and so on. All right? Prices now are 13 times what they were in 1938 because of the greed of all these people. But are we to believe that they weren't greedy in the 19th century when prices didn't go up? Or take the Swiss. Swiss has a much lower rate of inflation than this country. For about 3 years running, it only went up 1% in Switzerland. Are we to believe that the gnomes of Zurich are not greedy like their English counterparts? Obviously, a piece of nonsense, so you cannot explain inflation by alleged greed. You had a variation of this in Peregrine Worsthorne, who said that inflation was due to the spirit of evil. Well, I mean, here again, since when has evil, in his religious sort of terms, only existed in this country since 1938 and didn't exist in the 19th century? One odd explanation of inflation is used by the Communist Party on occasion. who say that it is due to armament expenditure. Well, of course, they do not explain why armament expenditure in the 19th century didn't also lead to inflation. A rather more difficult argument is the one that the last government and the present government and the city editors all use. They say inflation in this country has been caused by the oil-producing countries banding together 4 or 5 years ago and doubling and trebling the price of oil. They say because the oil-producing countries have put up the price of oil, this has compelled inflation to happen in Britain and other countries. Well, let's have a look at this. Suppose this had happened in the 19th century when there was no inflation because the note issue was restricted by the gold standard. In those circumstances, if you had got the price of oil doubling and trebling, or any other commodity doubling or trebling, what would have been the result? Since people's incomes, when there's no inflation, are not automatically increasing every month and every year by an increase in the note issue, if the price of oil went up, people would either have to buy less oil, or if they bought the same quantity of oil as before and therefore had to pay more for it, they'd have to spend less on everything else, or a mixture of both. So that what in fact would happen in those circumstances, if there was no inflation because the note issue was restricted, and if oil prices went up, oil prices would go up, but other prices would go down, and there would be no effect on the general price level. In other words, the rise in prices since the OPEC countries put out their oil prices has not been due to them putting out the oil prices. It has been due to the fact that all the governments of Europe, including the British government, have been busily printing and putting into circulation additional notes. There is another argument that inflation takes place because government expenditure is too high. And what they mean when they say that government expenditure is too high, they mean that government expenditure is high in relation to the total national income. Enoch Powell uses this argument, but if you look up Enoch Powell's book of his collected speeches, you will find a footnote where he says, I know the argument isn't really true. He says what he really means is that if governments spend too much, they are always tempted to go in for inflation. But he knows it is not true, because if the government raised all its revenue by taxation, it doesn't matter whether they raise a lot by taxation and spend a lot, or whether they raise a little by taxation and spend a lot, you would not have inflation. If it were true, of course, that government expenditure causes inflation, you would get the odd situation that as government expenditure relatively declined, inflation would decline, but in fact you don't find it doing so. But it is nevertheless true, Enoch Powell's quite true here, that in recent years you've had government increasing their expenditure quite rapidly, but it isn't that that's caused inflation. It is the fact that instead of raising the money by taxation, they've been raising it by printing more notes. Another alleged cause of inflation is that production is too low. Now here again, if low production caused inflation, in the years 1968 to 1973, production increased by 13%. It was a period of quite rapid growth of production. Well, according to their theory, as production increased rapidly in those years, production ought to have lessened. But in fact, in those years, prices went up by 45%. And make a comparison with 1938, or with 1951. Since 1951, production in this country has more than doubled. In 1951, production was very low. Well, according to this theory that low production causes inflation, prices ought to have been higher in 1951 than they are now, because production has been largely increased since 1951. I want to have a look at the way the Labour Party and the Tory Party have dealt with inflation. It has been caused in the last 30 years by both Labour and Tory governments acting on the principle that if the government printed and circulated excess notes, that this would enable them to cure unemployment and various other things. But in fact, neither the Tories nor the Labour Party have really understood what they were doing. While they've been increasing government expenditure, they have not, and have been printing more notes, they haven't understood that it is the printing of the notes that has caused the inflation. You will get them and individuals like Sir Keith Joseph and the Radcliffe Committee on the Monetary System, 1959, flatly denying that printing notes has anything whatever to do with inflation. So far as the Tories and Labour Party have had any policy at all, it has been that although they were causing inflation by printing notes but not understanding it, they were both of them trying to hold down prices by an incomes policy. Well, as you know, that has been a complete failure. While the last Labour government was in office, 5 years, 1974 to 79, while they were professing to be fighting inflation, they did in fact double the cost of living. But now, in recent years, first Callaghan and Healey in the Labour Party, and now a lot of the Tories, have come to recognise that you can't cure unemployment by the government spending more, which was a specific belief of the Labour Party at their conference in 1944. They laid down the proposition, if general unemployment threatens, you must give people more money to spend. But although they were saying this and have done it, they still didn't understand that it was this that has caused inflation. They didn't associate the inflation that was going on with the fact that they were printing more and more notes. But you can just look at the argument itself about government expenditure increasing production and therefore reducing unemployment. Between 1969 and 1978, government expenditure went up from 13,000 million to 51,500 million. In other words, it was multiplied by 4. Now, according to that Labour Party and early Tory theory, if government expenditure goes up so that it is 4 times as great, production ought to have been left up like it. But in fact, production grew hardly at all. And it ought to have reduced unemployment, but unemployment didn't fall. It went up from 580,000 in 1969 to over 1.5 million in the late 1970s. All that it did was to cause prices to rise. There are one or two difficulties that I would briefly refer to before leaving Marx's theory of inflation, and they are these. First of all, don't think that Marx is saying if the note issue increases, prices will go up. He's not saying that prices will go up because the note issue increases. He's saying that prices will go up if the note issue is issued in excess, which is not the same thing as a mere increase. Because if production, for example, is rapidly growing, the necessary amount of currency will itself be growing. So what would be an excess at a lower level of production is not an excess at a higher level of production. But it is not the increase, it is the excess that is the factor. Now this is different from the monetarist theory. Sir Keith Rees-Mogg of the Times lays down his monetarist theory in the terms that if the money supply goes up by 10% this year, prices will rise perhaps 18 months or 2 years later by 10%. I'm going to deal with this later. But you'll notice the difference between the monetarist theory, which is merely growth of the money supply, and Marxist theory, which is an excess of the inconvertible paper currency. Between 1820 and 1914, for example, there was a continuous or almost continuous increase in the currency. But it didn't put up prices because the currency only increased with production itself and was therefore not in excess. You ought to notice, by the way, that while inflation is a general rise of prices due to a depreciation of the currency, it is not the only kind of general rise of prices. Marx also pointed out that in a boom prices always go up, and in a depression prices always go down. And in that period from 1820 to 1914, prices never rose above the 1820 level, but they went down in depressions and they went up in booms within a range of about 25% each way. So you have to remember that you can have a cyclical movement of prices up and down, which has nothing to do with inflation, but is due to booms and depressions. Another point to notice is the question of the gold reserve. It is true, in the 19th century under the gold standard, the Bank of England had to maintain a gold reserve. Incidentally, it never had to have enough gold to cover the whole of its note issue, because it was allowed to issue some of its notes without gold backing. But nevertheless, it had a gold reserve always there. And the idea has grown up in some people's mind that it is the gold reserve that maintains the value of the note issue. This is quite wrong. It isn't the gold reserve that maintains the value of the note issue, it's the convertibility into gold at a fixed rate. You could run a gold standard, not with a very large amount of gold, as the Bank of England did, but with quite a small one, for the simple reason that once people have it in their idea that a Bank of England note is as good as gold, they don't want the gold. They'd much rather carry Bank of England notes. It's only when they begin to have doubt about it that people want to go to the bank and say, here's my paper, I want gold for it. So you would have only needed in the 19th century a much smaller gold reserve than they actually had. On the other hand, the existence of a big gold reserve without convertibility means nothing at all, although many governments at different times have gone to enormous expense to build up huge gold reserves without convertibility in the belief that by having a gold reserve their currency would maintain its value. But if there's no convertibility, they're wasting their money on maintaining a gold reserve. It serves no purpose at all. Switzerland, for example, has a gold reserve much larger than its total note issue. If the Swiss wanted to, they could, so to speak, call in all their paper and issue gold in its place. But as they have not got convertibility in Switzerland now at a fixed weight of gold, their gold reserve serves no useful purpose. At least it doesn't serve that purpose. It serves no purpose in relation to preventing inflation. And in fact, though it's a very small rate, the Swiss are now running something like 3 or 4% inflation. And their huge gold reserve does not prevent it. Again, remember, it is not the existence of a gold reserve, large or small, that prevents inflation. It is the restriction of the note issue. And you could restrict the note issue without having any gold reserve at all, and without even having any convertibility. You simply restrict the note issue. As happened in December 1919, when the Treasury issued a minute to the Bank of England saying print no more notes. And the Bank of England had to carry it out. They stopped adding to the note issue, and within months prices were coming down. And the same thing could be done now. They could run, so to speak, an effective non-inflation policy without having any gold reserve, provided they have some mechanism by which the note issue was restricted. The last point here on this first part of it is to remind you that Marx was saying that capitalism can be run with inflation or without. Marx wasn't expressing any particular preference to it. He just drew attention what the problems were. Marx was not saying, and neither do we, that the workers would be better off if there was no inflation. There was no inflation in the 19th century, and all the problems that the workers have to face now, they had to face then, with one exception. In the 19th century, if the workers got a wage increase, it was a real wage increase, because they were dealing with a stable price level. So when, as I said before, wages went up by 90% between 1850 and 1914, that was a little over 1% a year, this sort of thing. The workers were getting that much better off out of the increased production of capitalism. Since 1938, in the last 30-odd years when we've had continuous inflation, workers have got the illusion that they're getting great wage increases. But in fact, the real increase in wages is only been going on in the last 30, 40 years at much the same rate that it was in the 19th century. You can have a case in point. As you know, the miners recently put in a claim for 65% pay increase. They settled for 20%. And all they will really get out of it, when you've allowed for prices and for the effect of PAYE, they'll get perhaps 1 or 1.5% out of it. This is all they will get. In other words, the workers are living in a great world of illusion as regards this. And the last point of all, is it possible that the Thatcher government, even without understanding it, will eventually succeed in halting inflation? Well, it is a possibility. And for this reason, it may sound odd to say that a government can achieve a certain result without knowing what they're doing, except, as I've already pointed out to you, the Labourites who ran the inflation policy in the last 30 years also didn't know what they were doing. And it's equally possible for the Tories to run an anti-inflation policy without knowing how they get there. And the way it could happen is this. In addition to saying that they are monetarists, the Tories want to go back to the situation in which there is a balanced budget. In other words, they want to cut government expenditure so that the government spends no more than the income it raises by taxation. Now, if they got to a point where the government had got a balanced budget, where they were only spending the same amount that they were raising by taxation, and therefore having no possibility of raising some revenue by printing notes, they would in fact bring inflation to an end, even if they didn't understand it. What the prospects are of their doing it is, of course, another matter. Now, having got to the end of that part of it, I want, in the next half, to deal with monetary theory and so on. But at the moment, you may like to ask some questions about the Marxist part of it.
There's you mention about the armaments in the 19th century and the armaments today. The armaments what is today, 19th century, can't be compared to it anyway. A lot more.
No, but this wasn't the communist argument. The communist arguments say that armaments, by their very nature as armaments, cause inflation. Incidentally, if you were to say to the Communist Party, as the Russians spend an enormous amount of armaments, is there enormous inflation in Russia? The Communists would immediately say no. They would say this only happens in England. But the argument itself is false. Armament expenditure is no different from any other expenditure as far as the effect on inflation is concerned. Inflation is caused by an excess issue of an inconvertible paper currency. Whether you're spending some of it on armaments or not doesn't matter.
At the back.
Yes.
What's the exact connection between the note issue and the rise in prices?
Well, you mean how does it operate?
Yes.
Well, it's like this. When the government, through the Bank of England, prints and puts into circulation additional notes, like the 4,500 million that he did when he was Chancellor, this money is credited to the government account. It is money the government is going to spend. Well, you think to yourself, here is 4,000 million of additional money coming into the market to buy things. In fact, it's additional money, you see, that has cost the government nothing except the cost of the paper and printing. Here's additional money coming in the market to buy things. Naturally, it puts prices up. And if you think to yourself, this is quite obvious, you think to yourself of holiday resorts in the holiday season. In the holiday season, thousands of people move into holiday resorts with money to spend. And you know what happens in the summer season at holiday resorts? The price of everything goes up. Price of hotels, boarding houses, restaurants, everything goes up. In the winter, when these people move out again, the prices go down again. But you see the point. You bring new money into a particular market, additional money, up go prices. It becomes a seller's market. And well, yes, I mean, it's a demand that is not reflected in any increase in supply. It's simply additional money.
Allowing for the fact, you see, that the issue of notes is more than the market can bear, isn't it a fact, you see, that you can, you see, and it's proved that there are illustrative points, you know, where if you can get somebody to accept your depreciation of currency, you do ride it, don't you? I mean, we in this country have, you know, in the past, you know, through paying, you know, the Arab countries, you know, in depreciation of currency, which they don't accept now. You say they want it, you know, in a different form. Don't they ride the economy as a result?
Well, I mean, do you mean that, of course, for a long time the Americans and the British were buying oil in the Middle East with depreciating currency? And eventually the oil-producing countries got together and said, enough of this. We are either going to be paid in gold or we're going to put up our prices. But I mean, if that's what you mean, this is the answer. They were foolish not to have started from their point of view, if not having started it earlier.
Yeah, but is the only exception, you know, are the Swiss in that dominating position at the present time to do the very same? Eh?
Are who?
The Swiss.
Well, I mean, the Swiss, like the British government, can run an inflationary policy if they want to, or not run an inflationary policy. I mean, in this country, from 1914 to 1919, prices were rocketing out. They were running an inflationary policy. They set up the Cunliffe Committee, and the Cunliffe Committee reported on inflation, said what you want to do is to stop the issue of note issue. And the Lloyd George government then did as I said. They got the Treasury to write to the Bank of England and say, print no more notes. They ran an inflation policy for 5 years, and then they decided to end it. The British government could do it now, if they wanted to. But you see, you've now got this Keynesian influence has been behind them all, and they don't want to end it. They don't want to start reducing government expenditure and cutting things down. But they could have, there's nothing to prevent them if they want to, if they had the will to do it. And of course, if they understood what they're doing. But you've got this additional fact that, so to speak, there was much clearer understanding of inflation 50 or even 100 years ago than there is now. You've got a lot of people brought up by universities in recent years who only know the Keynesian stuff and who therefore don't understand inflation at all.
Yes.
Marx, through his theory of value, came to a conclusion that gold was the universal equivalent after having gone through a simple form of exchange and an accidental form of exchange, a general form of exchange, converting itself into the money form. Well, coming to that conclusion, he then says that gold had a dual personality or a dual purpose. It was the measure of value and it was the standard of price. Standard of price is a fixed rate of gold, that in terms of weight. Standard of price shows itself in weight. The measure of value shows itself in a certain amount of socially necessary labour time, social hours. Well, I was wondering with the antics of gold today whether it has lost one side of its personality, that is as a standard of price, where you see gold one day $500 an ounce, and then probably within 2 or 3 days it's $600 an ounce, and within a week could be $800 an ounce.
50.
See, I would think if gold is going to take on a standard and a fixed rate of gold, meaning an arbitrary, a given amount of money, then with that sort of erratic movement, I think that has spoiled that definition. So, can you get the point now?
Well, to start with, you see, Marx, it wasn't Marx, so to speak, who made gold a standard value, it was capitalism. Made gold their universal equivalent. Marx, in describing inflation, was in fact describing British capitalism. They had reached it, you see, and Marx says the reason why gold was a very useful universal equivalent, a money commodity, was because gold is not an absolutely stable commodity, but a relatively stable one. The conditions of producing gold don't change rapidly. It is quite true, late in the 19th century, the amount of labour required to produce an ounce of gold was falling. Not very much, but it had the effect of putting up prices. And incidentally, I should say something about that, as I will in a moment. But all the countries, or almost all the countries in the world, no longer have a convertible paper currency. So the value of gold no longer has any relation whatever to the price level. It's quite divorced from it. There is no gold reserve behind the British currency. You can't convert it. There isn't, I mean, they've even taken it away, so to speak. The Bank of England no longer has a gold reserve at all. The price level has risen because notes have been issued in excess. But look at it from the other point of view. The value of gold hasn't changed at all, or at least hasn't changed, or changed very little since 1938. So to speak, if you got the price level multiplied by 13 since 1938, you would expect if the value of gold hasn't changed, you would expect the price of gold to multiply by 13 times as well. But what you're noticing is that the price of gold has multiplied by much more than 13 times. Well, this is due to the specular development, because all over the world there are governments, the American government in particular, the Chile government, the Argentine government, and the British government, the Italian government, all depreciating their currency, and the French government. All over the world, I should throw in India as well, all over the world there are people trying to get out of paper. They're saying, look, the purchasing power of paper money is going to go on falling. We want to protect ourselves against this. And they've tried all sorts of things. They've bought paintings, they bought the junk you see in the junk shops, they bought commodities. And the one thing that for 100 years or more people have been buying when they want a hedge against inflation is gold. So people have been buying gold because they're afraid of paper money is losing its purchasing power. They're buying it as a safeguard. So they're all speculating. They're not paying a price for gold which is the current value of gold. They're paying a price for gold which assumes, look, if inflation's going on at 20% this year, 30%, 40%, I would be wise not to pay the current price, which is the current value of gold, but to price everything more, to buy myself into 5 years ahead. That's why the price of gold has rocketed up. It's speculation. The people are buying against what they fear may happen in the future. Now, if you want that to end, and Marx dealt with this, and other people, even other economists have dealt with it, if you get to a point where the leading countries of the world agree to stabilise their paper money and stop printing it in excess, then all these people who've been buying gold at speculative prices will be rushing out trying to sell it again, and the price of gold will come down to something like its value. I should, of course, have referred to the possibility of returning to a gold standard. Rees-Mogg is advocating it. He wants to return to the gold standard like the 19th century one, but he's wise enough to realise it would be ridiculous to go back to the 19th century. £1 equals a quarter ounce of gold, because that at the present moment that would be £1 note is worth 70 quid, which would be absurd. What Rees-Mogg would propose, which would be sensible, would be to go back to stabilise the currency at something like the present level, and then keep it under control with the gold standard. But, of course, as I've already pointed out, what he wants to achieve is to prevent an excess issue of paper money. And you can achieve that just as well, of course, without a gold standard, simply by restricting it. No, it requires some method of doing it.
Can I just bring back on that? The Bank of England doesn't have any gold reserves?
No.
Bullion.
It was taken away from the Bank of England and handed over to the Exchange Equalisation Fund, which also is run by the Bank of England, but it's not in the Bank of England banking department. If you look at the Bank of England accounts, you'll see nothing now about gold. In other words...
Why are these great fortresses all over the world protecting this gold?
Oh, well, they want the gold. They're going to give it away. But, I mean...
They must be aware then there's no value then.
Oh, it's highly valuable. I mean, gold at £70 an ounce, you can't say that's not valuable. Oh, no, they buy it for all sorts of reasons. One thing, I mean, the Russians, for example, are big gold producers. They have an enormous gold reserve somewhere, and incidentally, if you disclose where it is, you're liable to be shot in Russia, as a good old capitalist country, and attach a lot of importance to this. But they need it when Russia has a harvest failure and want to spend £100 million buying wheat in America or somewhere. The Americans aren't going to take ruble notes. In effect, the Russians have to pay in gold. That's the sort of thing. And every government wants a gold reserve for wartime. You see, in wartime, when other things, in wartime, nobody may be going to take your paper notes at all. I mean, the oil-producing countries have already, some of them said they won't take paper dollars or paper pounds. They want gold, and they want gold for this sort of reason. Oh, but gold hasn't lost its value. It is no longer convertible into the currency, which is as it was in the 19th century.
Yes.
Sorry, did you say, why did they stop the gold standard? Why did they give it up?
Well, they gave it up for two reasons. One, that they were dissatisfied with the way capitalism worked, and some people came along and said, you know, what's wrong with nothing wrong with capitalism, it's just having a gold standard that's bad for it. So you had certain individuals, Ernest Bevin, the Labour leader, was one, who advocated inflation and did know what he was talking about, by the way. And the banker who was the leader of the Chartist movement, Atwood, a leading banker, led the Chartist movement. He was an advocate of inflation in the 19th century. And remember, inflation is good for some people and bad for others. Keynes wrote about this. Keynes pointed out that inflation is good for borrowers and bad for lenders. See, if you're a borrower, by which he meant the industrial capitalist class, you borrow £1 million this year, and you have to pay your million back in 5 years' time, but you pay it back in depreciated currency. So inflation is good for borrowers and bad for lenders. It's the lenders who lose by inflation. So you've got one lot of people saying, look, capitalism would run better if we did have inflation. Others, and this is much more important, others saying, not let's have inflation, but saying let's have Keynes, let's have the government spending a lot more money, then we won't have any unemployment. This was the major reason why they went in for it, because they believed that by increasing government expenditure they could increase production and have no unemployment. And it's only, you see, experience has taught them that it is wrong. And Keynes' particular part in it was, Keynes, in his book he published in 1923 on monetary reform, laid down the proposition that he had been won over to the idea that it was no longer necessary to maintain any formal control over the note issue, by which he didn't mean that he wanted the note issue to be increased in excess. He just thought that you no longer needed to have formal control over it. Well, this was a view that a whole lot of economists and politicians accepted from Keynes. So this is the real reason why the major reason why they gave it up, was because they would be won over to Keynes' ideas. And this is the major reason why a lot of Tories are now abandoning it, because they've seen it didn't work. And they now think that they can find a salvation in monetarism, which they couldn't find in Keynesism.
Jim?
Yeah. Did Marx have anything to say about the way the currency circulates? Did he think it was stable?
Well, it was stable in which sense?
I mean, a set amount of currency, did that circulate at a set speed, or could it...
Oh, no. He was quite familiar with all the arguments about changing velocity of circulation.
And what did he say?
Well, I mean, what everybody else says, that it varies at different times.
And that would explain the rising price levels in booms and depressions?
Well, I mean, as he put it, very, very effectively, by the way, he said that in a depression, the capitalist is in need of cash. And what was his phrase? He pants for cash as the heart pants for the water brook, or something out of the Bible. In other words, he's trying to get hold of money at any price. He will go to a bank and borrow and pay fantastic rates of interest for it, or he will flog his goods in the market below their value in order to get some cash. Whereas in a boom, the capitalist doesn't want cash, he wants goods. So he's then rushing in the market trying to buy raw materials and things.
The goods preparing for a depression, or
Pardon?
he collects the goods preparing for the next depression?
Well, no, he's doing it because he hopes to make a profit out of it. So, as capitalism is expanding and moving towards a boom, the capitalist can now see that if he doesn't get in quickly, his rivals will get in first and get all the available material as it is. You see, in the last boom in this country, autumn of 1973, while there were a number of companies saying they were working below capacity because they hadn't gotten any orders, there were nearly half the companies at that time saying they were working below capacity because, at least they were unable to meet. They had so many orders, they were unable to meet them. They were short of goods. They were short of skilled workers, and among the odd things they were short of was steel. Autumn 1973, they couldn't get steel at any price. There was a shortage of it. Now, of course, they've got about 15 million tonnes too much or something like this. Now go on to the other half of this. You remember I said to you that Cannon, I think I did, Cannon described the monetary theories of the Keynesians and of the monetarists as a mystical school of banking theory. Well, Cannon was quite right to do so, as I hope I'll be able to convince you when I explain to you some of the things that the Keynesians and the monetarists believe. Cannon, by the way, tried to discuss it with Keynes, and he wrote to a friend of mine and said, look, I've got absolutely nowhere. I've come to the conclusion that either I'm mad or Keynes is mad. Well, events have shown, of course, that it is Keynes who was wrong and Cannon who was right. The Keynesian theories have blown up, and I mean, half the people who are Keynesians have now given them up. But let me first start with a sensible theory of banking before I go on to the Keynesian monetarist one. The sensible theory of banking is that the commercial banks, that's banks like Lloyds, Barclays, Midland and so on, excluding the Bank of England, that the commercial banks are intermediaries between depositors who lend their money to the banks and the customers to whom the banks then lend part of the money that depositors have left with them. As Marx put it, this is in Volume 3 of Capital, page 472 in the Kerr edition, borrowing and lending money becomes their particular business. They step as middlemen between the actual lender and the borrower of capital. The banking business consists of concentrating the loanable money capital in the banker's hands in large masses. In short, the banks are intermediaries. You've got depositors lending money to the banks, often in small quantities. The banks then lending some of that money to industry and personal borrowers, sometimes in large masses, but they are merely intermediaries. And the banks make their profit not primarily out of their own capital, but by using this money that is lent to them by depositors, and which they then lend to somebody else. Now, the mystical school of banking flatly denies that description by Marx. They deny that the bulk of the bank deposits come from depositors. They claim that the bulk of deposits are not lent to the banks by depositors, but are created by the banks themselves. This was set out in the one formal place that it existed in the 1931 report of the Macmillan Committee on Finance and Industry. If you look up the Macmillan report, paragraph 74, and I'll read to you. It is not unnatural to think of the deposits of a bank as being created by the public through the deposit of cash, but the bulk of the deposits arise out of the action of the banks themselves. For by granting loans, allowing money to be drawn on an overdraft, or by purchasing securities, a bank creates a credit in its books which is the equivalent of a deposit. That Macmillan report was signed by Keynes, among others, and by a whole body of bankers and some trade union officials and representatives of the Co-op Society and so on. And I was told by one of the members of the Macmillan Committee that that particular paragraph I've quoted, proving that the banks create deposits, was written by Keynes himself, as it probably was anyway. Of course, Keynes and the others signed the report. And the Macmillan Committee claimed to have proved that 90% of all bank deposits are not created by the depositors, but by the banks themselves. And as banks' profit is made by lending deposits, and the larger the deposits they have and can lend, the larger their profit, Major Douglas was being perfectly logical when he looked at that paragraph in the Macmillan report and said that this proves that the banks have power to create untold wealth by writing figures in a book. And a woman who believes in this mystical theory of banking wrote to the Financial Times on the 22nd of June 1972 and said, I quote, "When banks lend to customers, they create the money out of nothing." And Major Douglas was, and this woman, are perfectly right in saying that that is what the Macmillan Committee report was saying. And now we come to Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman has just issued a new book, and parts of it have been reproduced in the Sunday Telegraph on the 17th of February. And Milton Friedman wrote this. He said that inflation is caused by two things. First, by the government, which through the Bank of England prints notes, but also by the government, and I quote, which can legally authorise a bookkeeper to make entries in ledgers that are the equivalent of those pieces of paper, those pieces of notes. In other words, Milton Friedman is still saying the same thing that the Macmillan Committee said in 1931. You will notice, by the way, that as I think I've already mentioned, Milton Friedman is now riding two horses. He's now saying with Marx, inflation is caused by printing an excess number of banknotes, but then sticking on to it, but it's also caused by the banks creating deposits out of nothing. In 1931, I and a friend of mine wrote to most of the members of the Macmillan Committee and asked them, is it true, as Major Douglas says, that your paragraph proves that he is right when he says that banks create untold wealth out of nothing? Some of them didn't reply. Several of them did. 3 of them who were bankers and a professor of economics both wrote to us repudiating the paragraph, said they didn't agree with it at all, although they'd signed it. And the excuse of 2 of them was they never read it. They signed the report, but they weren't interested in that bit, so they didn't look at it. Another one, who was McKenna, Reginald McKenna, who was a politician turned banker, and who in the past himself had said that the banks create wealth out of nothing. As soon as he saw Major Douglas using it against him, McKenna wrote to me and said, of course I don't agree with him, you see. In other words, he'd seen the danger that he was getting into. Another member of the committee who knew something about Marx admitted to me that he didn't agree with it, and when I asked him why he signed it, he said, well, his boss told him he had to. Altogether, there were at least, I should say, 6 or 7 members of the committee who signed that report, including that paragraph, who, when they were challenged over it, repudiated and didn't agree with it. The Marxist on the committee said that he was quite sure that several members of the committee who didn't agree with it were afraid to say so because they were afraid to stand up to Keynes because Keynes had such a great reputation. Incidentally, I wrote to Keynes about it and got no answer, but some 5 years later in his general theory there's a rather obscure passage which appears to mean that Keynes had himself abandoned it, although Keynes had an odd way of writing some things, and you can't be absolutely sure. Now, how does this creation theory fit into the monetarist explanation of inflation? And the answer is this. For the monetarists, like Rees-Mogg and Sir Keith Joseph, the money supply, if the money supply increases, prices rise a year and a half or 2 years later. Now, the money supply for them means bank deposits. As the Radcliffe Committee, another finance committee in 1959, put it, and I quote, the total of bank deposits may be identified as the supply of money. And they went on to say that it is bank deposits which determine prices, not the currency. They dismissed the notes, the currency, they called it merely the small change of the banking system. So you get the monetarist argument. If the banks can create deposits at will, and if the increase in bank deposits causes prices to go up, you see what the monetarist argument is. If it were really true that the banks can create deposits at will and then go out and spend the money themselves or lend it to somebody else to spend, you can see why it would put up prices if the mystical theory were in fact true. And it would make sense for them to say that inflation is not caused by the Bank of England printing an excess amount of notes, but by the commercial banks creating deposits out of nothing. Now, the next stage in this monetarist argument is that while the banks can create deposits out of nothing by lending money, the government in turn can induce the banks either to lend more or not to lend more. The banks, the government, they say, through the Bank of England, can induce the banks to create deposits by selling treasury bills to them. Now, I want to repeat this to make sure you understand the richness of this mysticism. They say the government can induce the banks to lend more money by selling treasury bills to the banks. Now, selling treasury bills to the banks means borrowing from the banks. So what they're saying is that if the government borrows some money from the banks will now be able to lend more money to other people. Now, on the face of it, you'll say this, surely I've got it upside down. I mean, if the government borrows from the banks, on a common sense point of view, are less able to lend money to other people, not more able to lend money to other people. But I quote, this is from the City Editor of the Sunday Telegraph, 2nd of July 1972. Bank deposits and M3, that's the Bank of England measure of the money supply, will be increased by the government selling treasury bills to the banks. And again, I repeat, selling treasury bills to the banks means that the government, through the Bank of England, is borrowing more from the banks. So you're asked to believe that if the government borrows more from the banks, this enables the banks to lend more to other people, which, as I say, is contrary to all common sense. I have an article from the Times by a special correspondent on the 25th of February 1960 dealing with this subject and saying that in the textbooks there are two theories about this kind of operation. And I'd better read it carefully because it's so mystifying, that one can easily get the thing upside down. The Times said there are two theories in the economic textbooks. One theory said that if the government wants to reduce bank lending to industry, the government sells treasury bills to the banks, that is, borrows from them. The other theory says that if the government wants to reduce bank lending to industry, it buys treasury bills back from the banks. In other words, it repays its loans to the banks. Well, now you'll begin to understand why Cannon called this the mystical theory of banking. And one wonders what happens to the poor people who went in for bankers' exams, read these two theories of the banking, then went to work for the Bank of England. No wonder the Bank of England has often been accused by its critics of selling when it ought to be buying and buying when it ought to be selling. Cannon dealt with this stuff in a very interesting book of his called An Economist's Protest. And he relates a story there, this is back in the 20s when Chamberlain was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Chamberlain, as represented the government, wanted to discourage the banks from lending money to industry. And his advisers at the Treasury said to him that the way you can discourage the banks from lending money to industry is for you to repay your loans from the banks back to the banks. That if you repay your loans to the banks, in other words, give the banks more funds, the banks will be less able to lend money to private industry. And as Cannon pointed out, Chamberlain complained bitterly afterwards that as fast as he repaid the money to the banks lent it to somebody else, which after all is sheer common sense. But then this mystical theory of banking isn't commonsensical at all. It is what Cannon said. It is pure mysticism. The mystics were also, I've said already, the mystics were dealt with by Cannon in Economist's Protests, but they were also dealt with by Walter Leaf, who was chairman of a lot of banking institutes and was chairman of the Westminster Bank, in a Home University volume called Banking. And in it, Leaf wrote this: "The banks can lend no more than they can borrow, in fact not nearly so much. If anybody in the deposit banking system can be called a creator of credit, it is a depositor, for the banks are strictly limited in their lending operations by the amount that the depositors choose to deposit with them." Now this is the Marxist attitude of what banks are. They're merely intermediaries, as against the mystical view that the banks are created. Now, how did people like the Macmillan Committee come to believe that the banks create deposits by making loans? First of all, the statement they made, the statement, by the way, was invented by a financial journalist, Hartley Withers. The statement, "Every bank loan creates a deposit," you've probably heard this statement. The argument is that if, say, Lloyd's Bank agrees to lend Mr. X £1,000, it could let him have it by an overdraft, but it may let him have it by opening a loan account in his name and crediting it with £1,000, on which Mr. X can now draw. And the people who say the banks create credit say, there you are, they've lent Mr. X £1,000 and it's written in the bank's books as a deposit of £1,000, and therefore it increases the deposit. But this is a piece of pure mental confusion. What these people have not noticed is that at that stage when it's written in the book, the loan has not been made. It is merely the banks making a promise to lend him £1,000. At the stage where the loan is actually made, in other words, when Mr. X draws the £1,000 out of Lloyd's, or when he draws a cheque payable to somebody else who pays it into Barclays and who takes it out of Lloyd's, at that stage this figure of £1,000 deposit which they've written in their book disappears. In short, the whole thing is a piece of pure verbal illusion. They've mixed up a promise to pay with an actual loan. I mean, if I ask you to lend me £10 and you say I'll lend you £10, the loan hasn't been made until you actually let me have the £10,000, the £10 or whatever it is. The Macmillan Committee went into it in detail. I quoted that paragraph to you. They then set it out in detail, and they started like this. They said, let us imagine that a man deposits £1,000 cash in a bank. But they then proceeded to rig the whole argument by saying, we are assuming that there is only one bank in the world. That was their first assumption. So, if the man wanted to go to a bank, he couldn't go to any other bank than theirs. Anyway, they say, somebody deposits £1,000 in a bank, and we are saying it is the only bank in the world. They then imagine the bank lending £900 of that £1,000 to a Mr. X. Mr. X pays it to Mr. Y. And Mr. Y then brings the cheque back to this bank. He had to bring it back to this bank because they have said there's only one bank in the world. In other words, there was nowhere else where it could go. That's the first way in which they rigged the argument. Having got that £900 redeposited, they then repeat the operation and lend another £900 to somebody, and then another 900, another 900. They go through 10 operations of lending £900 to different people, and they end up with a story that the bank now in its books has assets of £9,000 loans outstanding plus £1,000 cash, which is 10,000, against liabilities of 10,000, which is deposits of £10,000. You see, this is the way they got at this. Well, notice one other curious thing. In order to carry through those 10 operations of lending £900 to different people, I mean, at a rough estimate, it take them probably a couple of months to do it. Now, while the Macmillan Committee said we are assuming there is only one bank in existence, they also assumed something else, but didn't say so, and it's even possible they never noticed it. Their curious bank is a bank in which, over a period of, say, 2 months, somebody deposits £1,000 cash in the bank, but nobody takes any money out. Not a single pound goes out of their one bank in the period of these operations. Now, in the real world, money is passing over the counters of banks in this country every day at the rate of about £1,000 million. But the Macmillan Committee don't know this. I mean, they're financial experts. They've never heard of banks which receive money in over the counter and also pay money out over the counter. They work the whole thing out as if the money only goes in and never comes out. Now look at it in the real world. Out of those 10 loans they've made of £900 each, somebody at least would have taken some money out. Now suppose when they made the first loan of £900 to somebody, suppose he'd taken it out in cash. It would have scotched all the remaining operations. They'd be finished because all their cash would have gone. And a bank can't lend money, I mean not in the real world, unless it's got cash to cover it. Because every cheque drawn on Lloyd's, which is paid into Barclays, takes that amount of cash out of Lloyd's. And incidentally, the Macmillan Committee, in other respects, of course, were quite well aware of this. In short, the whole of that Macmillan argument was rigged and didn't mean a thing. Now, this mystical theory of banking is still in the textbooks, although it has been modified a bit. In the early form, it was the one I've given you, Hartley Withers, said every bank loan creates a deposit, meaning that every time a bank lends somebody some money, it opens a loan account, writes £1,000 credit, and this appears in the books as a deposit. The later version, it's by the one I've taken here is J.L. Hansen, in a book called An Outline of Monetary Theory, 1969, page 14. Hansen doesn't use the example of a bank which lends somebody money on a loan account, but uses the example of a bank which lends somebody money by letting him overdraw on his account. And this is what Hansen said: if a customer has been granted an overdraft by his bank, he can draw cheques in excess of the amount standing to his credit, and such cheques increase the deposits of the payee's bank without reducing the deposits of the drawer's bank, therefore increasing total deposits. By which, what Hansen is saying, if a bank says to Mr. X, look, you want a loan of 1,000, we'll let you overdraw 1,000 on your own account, so no figure appear in Lloyd's banks about any deposit. The man can draw up to £1,000 overdraw on his account. Now suppose Mr. X, to whom Lloyd's lends £1,000 on overdraft, draws a cheque which he pays to Mr. Y, who pays it into Barclays. This, says Hansen, increases Barclays' deposits by £1,000, which is true, but he says it doesn't decrease deposits of Lloyd's, which is not true. What Mr. Hansen has entirely overlooked is that when the cheque for £1,000 is paid out of Lloyd's into Barclays through the clearinghouse, it automatically reduces by £1,000 Lloyd's bank's cash. You see, it moves out of Lloyd's into Barclays, so Lloyd's have lost £1,000 cash. Hansen is very well aware that banks must keep a certain amount of cash in their tills to meet the people who are on current account and come in and want cash on demand. So they've got to keep some cash there. And Hansen, in his example, works it all out on the basis that they keep 8% in cash. I mean, it doesn't matter what figure you take. Banks can sometimes they can run their cash ratio very much lower than 8%. But Hansen is working it out on 8% right throughout the example. And what he's overlooked is this. When Lloyd's loses £1,000 cash to Barclays, their cash reserve is automatically reduced below 8%. In other words, they're lending more than under their own rules they can be lending. And the only thing Lloyd's can do is to try to get more cash back, which they could do, for example, by selling some by selling some government security to one of their own depositors, in which case the depositor's account will be reduced by the cost of the security, and he will now have the security, and his deposit with Lloyd's will be reduced. But you see what the effect of this is. When Hansen says Barclays deposits are increased, which is true, Lloyd's deposits are not decreased, he's forgotten his cash ratio, because the loss of the cash will compel Lloyd's to call in some of their loans in order to restore their cash ratio. In short, the thing is another misapprehension, it's another piece of mysticism. Now, by the way, if the monetarist theory and the Keynesian theory on banking is fallacious, you can also test the monetarist case by the actual facts of the situation. Remember, they say, if money supply rises, prices will rise at some later date. Now, first of all, none of these monetarists can make up their minds what they mean by the money supply. The Americans have got two versions, and they've just introduced two more. The American Federal Reserve Bank was announced last week. The Bank of England has 3 or possibly 4. They're called M1, M2, M3, and domestic credit expansion, and they are now conducting a massive inquiry into whether they won't find some new way of defining what is the money supply. And the trouble is M1 is based on bank deposits on current account. M3 is based on bank deposits of all kinds, including current account and deposit account. Well, what they have found by experience is M1 and M3 don't move together. They frequently move in opposite directions. M1 will be going up and M3 will be going down. So when they're looking at the money supply, they're up against all sorts of problems like this that, as I say, they cannot make up their minds which definition of money supply they want to use. Next, they have completely failed to control the money supply. If you look at the record, since 1969, every government in this country has claimed that it's got the money supply under control. And periodically you will notice governments announcing what the target is. And equally, periodically, every 3 months or so, you will get the government and the Bank of England saying, we targeted for the money supply to rise 7%, and we find it's actually written 10% or 12%. In short, they have shown that they do not control their money supply, however they may choose to define it. Next, prices do not move along with the money supply. You'll remember the Radcliffe Committee defined money as bank deposits, and they said, don't worry about the currency, this doesn't count. Between 1877 and 1914, bank deposits more than doubled. I take 1877 because it is the first year in which there was a comprehensive figure of total bank deposits. Between 1877 and 1914, bank deposits doubled, so what they now call the money supply doubled. But prices didn't rise, they didn't double, they fell 10%. Between 1921 and 1931, bank deposits didn't move at all, or rather they moved and recovered. In 1931, bank deposits were almost identical with 1921. So according to the monetary theory, the price level should have been the same in 1931 as in 1921. But it had in fact fallen 42%. It had fallen 42% because the government was restricting the note issue through the Bank of England. 1971 to 75, money supply rose by 105%, prices rose by only 69%. Now, of course, they might come along here and saying, yes, but the effect came along later on, but 5 years is a fairly satisfactory period to take for a thing like this. And also, remember, from 1820 to 1914, bank deposits were rising all the time, but prices were not rising, prices were controlled. One last look at Marx and the monetarists. Notice another difference between them. Marx showed what causes inflation, and showed that sometimes governments have gone in for inflation and sometimes they haven't, and some countries have gone in for inflation and some other countries haven't. And Marx didn't suggest that stopping inflation would solve any of the other problems of capitalism. He didn't suggest it would solve the unemployment problem, or that it would prevent crises and depressions or anything like this. All he said was that if you have inflation, your prices will go up. If you don't have inflation, your prices will be relatively stable, except for the cyclical movements during booms and depressions. But the monetarists are quite different. If you look, and you ought to look at the speeches made by the monetarists, either by the government or by their critics, people like Milton Friedman or his critics like Lord Cowdell, you'll find that none of them are in fact saying there is a problem of inflation, this is how to solve it. In other words, there are none of them saying let's get rid of inflation. What they're all saying is let's find a policy that will simultaneously solve the inflation problem, solve the unemployment problem, secure a big increase in production, solve the balance of trade problem, and maintain the foreign exchange of the pound. In other words, there are none of them looking at the real problem. They're all of them asking for something which is impossible. There cannot be a policy which does all these things. There cannot be a policy which enables capitalism to run without unemployment, without booms and depressions, and without all these other problems. So what these people are doing is asking for the impossible. I saw an article in the Financial Times last week, an editorial criticising Thatcher's government and saying Thatcher's government's policies won't succeed. And they didn't say it won't succeed because it won't solve the inflation problem. What they said was it won't succeed because it will not simultaneously stop prices rising and reduce unemployment. In other words, there's the poor old Financial Times again asking for the impossible. And Rees-Mogg of the Times is in the same boat. For about 20 years, Rees-Mogg was a Keynesian, believing that the government could solve unemployment by increasing government expenditure, and that it would not cause inflation. When he found it did cause inflation, and it didn't solve the unemployment problem, Rees-Mogg threw Keynes overboard and reached the other absurd conclusion that unemployment is due to Keynes. And if we get rid of Keynes, we won't have unemployment. Again, not realising that unemployment is due to capitalism, whether you have an inflation policy or not. In short, all of these people, the Keynesians and the monetarists, suffer from one thing: they do not understand either Marx's inflation theory or capitalism in general.
Well, anyone got any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. Oh, well, what's the inflation of Germany in the early 1920s? It didn't go up to millions, to billions, it went up to trillions.
Right. And the reason was, it's a curious case. In the 1920s, I've forgotten the precise date, in the 1920s, France and Belgium took action against Germany because Germany was refusing to pay reparations, and French and Belgian troops moved into the Ruhr. And the German government, and it shows what capitalist governments would do on some occasions, the German government called a strike of all the coal miners and steel workers in the Ruhr. They were all out of work, and they had to get wages. So the German government then said to the Reichsbank in Germany, go on printing notes at unlimited amounts in order to pay wages to all these coal and steel workers we've called out on strike, and to all the other workers in Germany who are out of work in consequence of the French-Belgian occupation of the Ruhr. And this is the real thing that set the inflation going. They literally told the bank to print notes 24 hours a day, get them out as fast as they could in order to meet all these people. And as you say, prices rose by billions and trillions. Actually, I was in Cologne at the time, and I can remember when there's hyperinflation like that, nobody wants to hold paper money. So if anybody sells something and gets paper money, he's got to be sure that he can immediately spend the paper money. And if you wanted a razor blade for a safety razor, you would be a note that at 2 o'clock on Thursday at a certain shop you could get one blade. And you'd go there with a queue of people wanting to buy one blade. And of course, they wanted you to pay in English money. They didn't want German money. But if they had to take German paper money, at the moment that you handed in the money, they would have a man there ready, collecting all the money and rushing off to buy something else that he had already agreed to buy. I mean, this is what happens with inflation. And of course, it got to the time where capital, as Mark pointed out, if you carry on the depreciation of the currency beyond a certain point, the whole thing breaks down. In other words, it got to the point where it wasn't worthwhile German workers going to work. Or if they did go to work, they would only go to work in jobs like the railways, food places, and the post office, where they didn't go to work to get wages. They went to work to steal all the goods that were passing through the post office and the railways.
I recently heard that the Israeli government was thinking of changing their money completely to a different, shekel. Is it? I mean, their inflation rate is getting out of hand. Is it because of
over 100%? But if
same reason.
Well, yeah, for the usual reason, they're printing too much paper. But if I read you read the same article I did in one of the papers today, I couldn't believe it. They say,
spiritual reason.
Yeah, spiritual reason. They're supposed to believe that the pound has no spiritual value to Israelites, and that the shekel, which is an Old Testament term, has a spiritual value, and this will prevent prices from rising. Well, this is even worse than the mystical school of banking over here.
Because there was another...
Somebody had his hand up.
There was another reason you're pointing out, you see, that because the British, because it's associated with our pound, you see, it's losing out as well.
Even with us seeing the view to banking if it could come about to no excess of money being printed, but not do anything for the class at all.
Wouldn't do anything to the working class. Why? What would it do?
Well, a saving buying system.
Well, see, it could.
Method of getting,
It could do something for some of the capitalists. You see, some of the capitalists have done very well out of inflation. They may not want it changed.
Well, would the saving banking system not help us in something?
Well, help who? Won't help the working class. Why would it help the working class?
The inflationary thing is in fact, we're losing our wages every time inflation continues. Money that I'll earn today is not worth the same tomorrow.
No,
but get a banking system, surely.
This raised another interesting point in the controversy between Cannon and Keynes. Keynes said that while you couldn't reduce workers' wages, you could get the same effect by putting up prices, as long as you didn't too much, because Keynes said the workers wouldn't notice. And Cannon replied to Keynes, look, you don't know the workers. They soon will notice. And of course, what happened, when there was no inflation, workers used to claim, say, an increase, the dockers, sixpence a day or whatever it was, or 5% or something like this. Nowadays, workers, trade unions making claim, don't even name what the figure is. They'll put in a claim, say, for a substantial amount. All like the miners claim 65%. But they don't, the result, as I already mentioned, is that as far as real wages are concerned, real wages have been rising at a small rate of 1.5% a year in the last 30 years, just as they were in the 19th century.
Then do you believe I have better buying power with my money today?
Sure. Most workers are better off than they were in 1930. Some of them are not. Well, you go and look it up and see. I know a lot of workers will... You listen into some phone-in programs and you'll hear workers saying, my wages haven't gone up for 10 years or something like that. But you don't have to believe it. These are odd cases.
Do you think there's any danger in an argument now that's becoming very popular with trade unionists, and that is in keeping wages in relation to the cost of living? What would happen if the cost of living was to drop for the wages? And
It's a very dangerous argument. The real trade union argument for workers is they should not worry about things like the retail price index. They should try always to get as much as they can for the labour power they sell. This is it. They've had this system. In 1919, I already told you, in 1919 the government had decided to end inflation. And the Bank of England was told by the Treasury not to print any more notes. Now, at that time, people in the Bank of England did understand inflation, and they knew the result of this was going to be that the rise of prices would stop. Well, in 1919, they entered into an agreement with the Civil Service National Whitley Council for the whole of the civil service, including the post office, to give them a sliding scale bonus, which was based on this, that every 6 months, the pay of civil servants, including the post office and the industrial staffs, was readjusted to the movement of the retail price index in the previous 6 months. Well, of course, the civil servants were cock-a-hoop in 1919 because their wages shot up like this. But the Treasury knew better than they did. The Treasury were looking ahead. And in 1920, the retail price index started coming down. And then for the next 8 or 9 years, every 6 months, civil service and post office pay was coming down. And then they fought, so to speak, a losing battle against it. They had lost the initiative. They would have been far better advised in 1919 not to have accepted it, but simply to said, we want as much as we can get, and every time we think there's a chance of getting more, we'll try to get it. It might not have made much difference, but it would have made a little.
Yeah. What I've got to say, that there was a time with Big Charlie de Gaulle there, when the pound was worth 1,500. But what he did do, he cut off the 2 notes. And what was floating around 50 francs, it went down to 50 centimes.
Yes.
Couldn't speak because you're still praying within the upper just the same.
And, of course, no sooner had they done it than France proceeded to resume the process of inflation by still printing more of the new notes. What governments can do is what the Russian government did in 1947. They had had massive inflation in Russia, 1947, they suddenly called in all the old notes. They said, next Monday, you present at the bank all your old notes, and we'll give you 1 new ruble note for every 10 old ones. Well, it was quite a clever trick, because there had been enormous numbers of people in Russia, or very large numbers of people, trading in the black market who had built up huge fortunes. They then had to go along to the state bank in Russia on the Monday morning and say, look, I've got 10 million notes here, will you let me have 1 million new notes for them? And the bank would say, where'd you get this from? In short, they couldn't do it. A lot of this black market fortunes were wiped out at a stroke by this move.
Yes, the Russians done it after the war, wasn't it? 100 old rubles for 1 new ruble. Isn't it called making the currency heavy?
Well, that's what they said. Of course, the Russians keep up another pretence. The Russians pretend that their currency is backed by gold, but of course it doesn't mean a thing. If you haven't got convertibility, it's no use the Russian government saying, as they do from time to time, they say the ruble is worth 1/8 of an ounce of gold, or whatever it is in Russian measurement. And it doesn't mean a thing. You cannot take a ruble note to a Russian bank and say, I want 1/8 of an ounce of gold to it. You can't do anything any more than you can with the British one, which says, I promise to pay £1. It's pure myth. I mean, presumably there are some people deceived by it, but as also presumably there are Marxists in the Russian government who know what Marxist theory of inflation is, they know that it is a confidence trick they're playing. Although it's only 2 years ago, Pravda had an article advising the British government to go back to the gold standard in order to end inflation, which of course the Russians don't intend to do themselves.
Can I, Comrade, when supply equates demand, then prices should be pretty standard. I mean, we'll say that just for the sake of argument.
You mean the general price level?
The general price level should remain.
Well, I mean, you see, but demand by what means? You see, if the government is printing more notes.
Incidental. I'm just trying to get sidestep the supply and demand argument. You see, for prices. I'm trying to make something of these monetarists, you see, who say that deposits are potential purchasing, or purchasing potential. Whether they're being used or not, it is money available. We say that doesn't cause inflation. They say it does. Money in the pocket, no matter the quantity, no matter the volume, deposited in the pocket instead of the banks, should be a potential for inflation because it's potential purchasing. It's buying potential. We would say that doesn't cause inflation. People in the marketplaces are ready to hand their money over to buy things. Again, there is the actual purchasing taking place. No matter what the volume be, we say that doesn't cause inflation. We along with Marx, say that it is an excess issue of currency by the government. Now, see, I'm wondering how the sellers get this information. How can they distinguish between a pound note that is a product of excess government issue to a pound note which is hard-won money, hard-gained money by a worker or by a capitalist?
Well, the answer to your last point, deal with it first, they can't. But if the government goes in the market with an additional 4,500 million buying things, the shopkeeper doesn't have to worry about where it came from. He knows it's a seller's market. He just puts up his prices. But remember this, see, all that you've said about money in the pocket and so on was true of the 19th century. But you didn't have inflation. And what you've overlooked, you started off by saying that deposits in the bank are potential purchasing power. But what you've forgotten about the monetarists aren't saying deposits in the bank are potential purchasing power. What they're saying is that deposits in the bank are 10 times as much as the depositors put in the banks. You see, suppose the depositor didn't put it in the banks. Suppose you've got £1,000 and instead of lending it to Lloyds, you lend it to the ICI or something. Suppose you lend it to ICI yourself. Well, it doesn't. You wouldn't argue that if you lend that to ICI and put up prices, But if you lend it to Lloyds, and according to the mystical school of banking, they turn your £1,000 into £10,000, and of course you can see that if such a thing could happen, it put up prices.
They pointed out that even if the money just arrived, what they overlooked is what we said earlier, that money doesn't circulate in an even fashion. It can slow down or speed up. So if you lend your £10,000 to ICI, all that may happen is that things may just slow down, and your £10,000 will circulate at the same speed, 10 times slower, making it equivalent to £1,000. So nothing will happen. The price level will stay static.
I mean, in other words, it is a pure mythical belief, but it's so staggering, you see. By the way, the man who invented it in modern terms was Hartley Withers, a financial journalist. And Hartley Withers, before Hartley Withers invented it, the saying was already known, and it was a perfectly true statement. It used to be said by bank managers. I mean, take a bank manager in some small provincial town in the 19th century. Bank managers getting together, and they would say every bank loan creates deposits. And what they meant was, if a bank looked into some aspiring businessman who wanted to borrow money and decided it was a good case, and lent him £10,000, and he used it in his business, the bank managers would say, every loan creates a deposit. We lend something to so. He'll be a good customer ours later on. As he prospers, he will bring back his deposit to us. So the statement originally was perfectly sensible and was well known. Hartley Withers, financial journalist, comes along and tries to give it this new meaning of saying that every bank loan itself creates a deposit, which you see has no relation to the original meaning at all. But Hartley Withers used an argument, which incidentally Marx dealt with 100 years ago. Hartley Withers said the banks must have created these deposits. And he would take a small provincial town and he said, look, the volume of deposits in the local bank is larger than all the money in the town. And therefore the banks must have created it. The money just doesn't exist. Well, Marx dealt with this 100 years ago. Hartley Withers and all these other people overlooked the time factor. Suppose Lloyds Bank is receiving deposits at the rate of 100 million a week and withdrawals at the rate of 50 million a week. Then as the 50 million, then their deposits are growing in Lloyds at 50 million a week, £50 million a week. Lloyds doesn't keep the money. I mean, the last thing that the banks ever want to do is have money in their tills. As fast as this 50 million a week's coming in, Lloyds is lending it to somebody. It's gone, you see. But the figures still remain in their books. They still owe this money to depositors, and it is owed to them by the people to whom they've lent it. Well, you see, if Lloyds deposits are accumulating at 50 million a week, in 4 weeks it'll be 200 million. In a year it'll be, 240 million, have I got it right? In 10 years it may be 10,000 million. And as Marx pointed out in his own day, the deposits in the banks were larger than all the currency in existence, but it doesn't mean a thing because of this time factor, that the money doesn't stay there, it's just passing through the banks.
Oh, is there another short question?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, recent weeks, or recent days, there have been reports that the American government intends spending more money on arms, arms manufacturing. And the figure was put forward something like about 16 billion they intended to spend. And there was some sort of speculation that the 16 billion could in actual fact work out 100 billion by the time they get going. I think for the next 2 or 3 days, the Wall Street, there was a sort of minor boom, and the Dow Jones Index went up, and a rosy picture was painted of the American economy beginning to grow again. And then within a few days, a report recently indicates that inflation is starting to leap ahead. Price levels have gone up. Well, I mean, I can only put that down to the fact that it must be reckoned recognise that the only way those arms are going to be paid for is by the government paying for them. The only way they can pay for them is either to increase taxation or just print more money. It appears that this is what they have to do, print more money, because the economy won't stand where it did increasing taxation. Well, you said earlier that arms manufacturing does not necessarily lead to inflation any more than spending money on the welfare state or any other service. But, I mean, for all intents and purposes, that is the sort of cause of inflation at the moment in the States.
Well, but not really, as you're using Enoch Powell's argument, which he admits is not true. What you're saying is what Enoch Powell says, that for political reasons, when governments want to make a big expenditure on armaments or anything else, they prefer to do it by printing money rather than increasing taxation. You see, if they print money, the bill, so to speak, doesn't have to be paid till next year when prices go up. If they raise taxation, the taxation is raised immediately and there's a howl on. What's determining the American government's attitude is they're in a presidential election year. There's nothing to prevent them, if they want to, paying for all their armaments by taxation.
Time is running a bit short, so if you can...
Would a sensible banking system then benefit anyone?
What do you mean? Well, it benefits capitalist class. Capitalist class can't do without it.
The inflation, everything.
Two things, you see. While in general, inflation is good for borrowers and bad for lenders, there is the thing that, as Marx pointed out, inflation, once you've launched on it, governments tend to do it faster and faster in order to keep up. And there comes a time when it all breaks down. Well, that is not good for the capitalist class. It was not good for the capitalist class in Germany when everything literally broke down, when workers wouldn't even take the trouble to go to work. They had then to stop it and start again with a stable currency. So they're in a dilemma. A lot of capitalists rather like inflation, as long as it's nice and gentle and doesn't get out of hand. And a lot of trade union officials in general love inflation. It's much better for them to be able to say to the workers, we've got you 20% increase in pay. What?
You wouldn't be happy with the abolishment of inflation?
No. No, you imagine you're a trade union. You imagine you're a trade union official. No inflation, stable prices, stable. And you go along to your members at your annual conference and say, "Well, we've done very well this year. We've got you 0.25% increase in pay," or something like this. He'd much rather go to them and say, "We've got you 20%." And if it weren't for these greedy shopkeepers, it would have been worth 20%. As it is, he doesn't even go into the question as to what it's worth. Trade union officials love inflation, and a lot of capitalists love inflation. But the capitalist class they don't want the capitalist system to break down, as it would do if they carry inflation too far.